there's been a lot of criticism around him having a writing credit on Drake's Certified Lover Boy album. And, here at Brewin Black, we talk about these things, but we also want to bring in the voices of experts who have dedicated their lives to not only talking about these issues, but illuminating and shining a light on why these issues are so important and pertinent in today's society. And so right now, if you will allow us, we want to bring on a very special guest. All right. We have Dr. Charles H. Davis, H.F. Davis III. And he is a third generation educator. And he is a creative who is committed to the lives, love, and liberation of everyday Black people. All right. He's currently an assistant professor in the Center for the Study of Higher Ed and Post-Secondary Education at the University of Michigan, where his work broadly focuses on the issues of race, racism, and resistance in education and society. Okay. Now, as a creative, he primarily uses his photography and film to explore the materiality of Black culture and the socio-political lives of everyday Black people in the U.S. and abroad. Now, he's also an organizer and the founder and director for the Scholars for Black Lives Collective, which serves on the board of the BLD PWR and considers Black Lives Matter Los Angeles his actual political home. And so, Dr. Davis, we want to welcome you to the show. Thank you so much. Yeah, you and I actually had the pleasure of meeting on the Tammy Mack late night show, and this brother was giving us all the great info on the history of blacks in higher education and some of the current issues that we still deal with. And so, just such an honor to have you. We had a very, very great intro, but I want to give you a chance to tell people things that the intro might not have even caught. Like, what do you want the people to know about you?
First, and foremost, TP, appreciate y'all for holding the space and letting a brother jump on. I think, these are the insurgent and maroonage kind of educational spaces that we have to take up, seriously, the labor of contributing to the liberation of our people. So, I just am always thankful for the opportunity to get on board and to just be invited into a space ever. So I just want to, extend my appreciation for that. I actually am in maybe a fortunate position where, unlike many situations, right, especially as scholars and the sort of like ego that comes along with that, right? And I know we were just talking about Ye and Drake, and I think there's some parallels we could draw between intellectual, right, and creative egos in that space, especially for Black men. But I think the bio, was perfectly fine, and part of that, for me, was wanting to write into the record a version of myself that I actually thought was legitimate and real, right? And so there's often this deference that's paid to scholars and PhD holders in a certain kind of way that I think only feeds the ego. And so me trying to sort of check myself in these moments where you can have all the superlatives and all this other stuff, right? But what humanizes you and want to communicate that. And I think if there's anything that I would hope folks derive from, the bio that you shared, and to be sure you read it exactly as I wrote it. So your check is in the mail, brother. It's just, I'm more or less just, I'm a regular nigga like everybody else. And I understand the world sees and treats me as such. And so to consider myself as a better Black, if you will, that some people might in this space, is only in service to white supremacy.
That's a bar.
Absolutely. Jeez. Well, I want to start this off too by saying you come off, because you are such a genuine person, a down-to-earth person, a person that chooses to humanize yourself before, talking about all your credentials, even though you have plenty, right? So we know who we're dealing with from a professional standpoint, and we respect that. But we love also how you say, hey, look, I'm a regular nigga like everybody else. Just doing my part, knowing what my role is, and so sort of stepping in that 1,000%, right? And so I mentioned that because one of the most human elements is expressing your thoughts, right? And being willing and vulnerable enough to express your thoughts, especially on places like social media. And this is where this all sort of starts, right? Because I saw a great tweet, and me and T. Shaw, we had been talking, and other people in our lives had seen the tweet going around, and so it's this idea that your thoughts were actually connecting with people, and so I'm gonna pull it up, and I'm gonna allow you to read it, and I want you to sort of tell us what prompted you to make that and sort of break that down for our audience, if that's all right.
Yeah, for sure.
All righty, let's see here. All right. So, all right. Everybody see it?
Yeah.
Awesome. So, Dr. Davis, if you will read your tweet, and then I'll hit the next button when you're ready to go to the second one.
For sure. Yeah. So I wrote, between Ye bringing out the baby and Marilyn Manson and Drake knowingly sampling and listing R. Kelly as a writer, and all of us Black men who continue to disregard these actions as insignificant or quote unquote not that deep, it's no wonder we can't get free as a people. And so we prioritize the well-being of Black women and girls, femmes, trans, and non-binary folks, including their psychological safety, which is undermined every time we legitimize and prop up their abusers. Black lives will always be vulnerable, and we will never be free.
Ooh,
Real.
Jeez. Okay, so will you walk us through what inspired this particular tweet?
Yeah, I mean, I think our generation of scholars, exists in a hyper-mediated society, not one that we are like passively a part of, but we are deeply integrated into, right? So like even for yourselves, as scholars in your own right, even in the graduate school space, that, we live lives that exist within and beyond the academy, and we are connected and always, sort of engaged with the popular moment. Right. In many ways, it speaks to our lived experiences beyond the one dimension often, right, that academia sort of says you have to operate in, which is largely about being respectable. So, within that context, I'm always sort of just trying to keep attuned to what's happening. And as I'm, getting older, it's partly just to be in line with what my students are experiencing and engaging with every day, right? So like as higher ed folks, we know that student affairs is, sort of the other half of the conversation within the study, right, in the practice of higher ed. So yeah, working with student affairs folks means they work with young people. So you need to know kind of what's happening in and around young people's lives in order to be of best service to them. And I think about that pedagogically in my classroom, right? Especially for my students of color, right? In that, in the academy, we don't often speak the language of each other, and we are expected to quote unquote acquiesce up, right, into the King's English in a particular kind of way. But I need to be able to make sense of theory and practice in a way that folks understand based on everyday experiences, and popular culture is a great way to do that. So, coming into this particular moment, I've also learned over years and trying to exercise humility that like, I don't need to say something every time something's happening. And I think that's, again, a challenge of a generation, especially when you're expected to be, the smart Black person, always have something to say. But I do find that if I take a step back and I pause, I can see the landscape of the, perspectives that are out there, right? In the education world, we would say that's like, you're trying to survey the literature, right? What does the literature say, right? Who has written about this? What are the analyses they're offering? What are the arguments? So I kind of take it in the same approach. And then I say to myself, if I can offer something that otherwise isn't already out there, I'll say some shit, right? Now, this intersects too with this responsibility I feel as a heterosexual cisgender Black man, right? To speak in ways that speak to people like me that maybe have a different perspective, right? And that's when I feel like there's an impetus to say something around issues of gender, specifically around masculinity, right, and manhood, and how we construct those ideas of self, but also how we are invested in and, participatory or complicit with patriarchy in terms of how it operates, and misogyny and how it operates, right? Sort of this deep, often subconscious in some regards, but also conscious decision to be invested in the detriment of, women or men who can perform masculinity beyond the narrow confines of, what we determine that to be. So anyway, all of that's converging in this moment where I'm trying to, think of myself as someone who can help connect dots and facilitate learning, which isn't about necessarily being expert because I know everything, but I am seeing what's happening, and I need to make these connections because I don't think these things are unrelated. And I know that often the easier route is to look at things in isolation, right? But what happens when we look at them all together and we start actually, when we say we want an analysis of systems, structures, right? This is a system and structure that's operating that people need to kind of, be up on game in the same way that somebody put me on it. And that's what basically just happened in that moment.
Okay.
Right.
And then in your thread, you go on to talk about how you connect this to what's happening in Texas right now. A lot of people in the comments didn't understand that connection. Would you be able to go a little bit more in depth into how those two connect, that pop culture and the legal side of things?
Yeah. So like my response whenever, niggas is like, it's not that deep. And I'm like, well, why isn't it?
Oh,
right. Like run it for me. Why isn't it that deep? Right. And there are a bunch of folks in the comments, mostly, again, other cis, hetero Black men, we're saying it ain't that, it ain't this or whatever. And that usually means two things. Like one, that we don't have the ability, right? We don't have the range, right, around these topics and issues.
The readings, yeah.
Right. Because if we go too deep, right, then you might drown. And that's part of the problem. Right. So I think there's that aspect of it. And again, we need to see this at the 30,000 foot level, right? So I can like try to walk us through why it is that deep. And so the connection for me was that, when we move beyond the surface, and this is an important part too, like I'm cool. Like everybody does have an opinion. Everybody got a perspective. As a scholar, right, or someone who's thought to be a sort of knowledge expert in this way, we don't have the benefit of just having opinions. And if you've ever been in a class, you know that an opinion ain't worth nothing. You need to have an analysis. Right. And so when we think about knowledge as a political artifact, right, a political thing that we can construct, deconstruct, and reconstruct, then we need better analyses to understand today's intractable problems. And so part of what I was trying to offer was like, all right, let's just put it in terms that make sense. Drake be riding out for Houston on a regular basis. And with all due respect, Houston be riding out for Drake, right? He's good in the street. Cool. But where is Houston located? Right. And so for all of these women, fictitious or otherwise, you listen in these songs, right, that work at the Galleria or wherever else, right, who now will be, directly impacted by the legislative decisions, because we know any law that's passed will first and foremost, be to the detriment of Black people, Black women specifically, right? Then it should be that deep to think through, right, whether I'm going to, one, decide to keep this song on my listing, because there was an argument made like Drake didn't know. Drake does know, right? Drake is involved in every single decision at every single level. So he knew, and it probably wasn't maybe a big deal to him to do this. But you're taking like a top, we'll say top 2 predators of Black women in our lifetime, and he ain't number 2, and got him on there, right? And you have a state that is now, and again, you can't forecast that this is going to happen, right, if you're Drake necessarily, but now you have a state that you say you love that is making it clear for women who need reproductive justice they can't have it. At the same time, you're elevating, right, a person who is deeply responsible for situations and circumstances, right, that put women that are already vulnerable into more vulnerable situations and have likely had to deal with some form of reproductive justice in their own lifetime. So to me, it's saying that it's not about one causing the other or not. And that got misunderstood quite a bit, right? It's not what we're saying. We're saying that there are multiple correlations about what's happening in popular culture, what's happening in policy, right, in politics, in this particular socio-political moment. And to be sure, it's not like I'm looking to rappers to be like, the social justice warriors of our day. I don't think that's the case, nor should it be. Right, they're people and have a full range to exist and how they want to exist. But let's not act like it don't mean nothing, because the main point of the tweet, which is like later down, right, is like a lot of Black men do take their cues from folks like this. So if I'm that person, I feel like you should have a responsibility to do and say something, better that moves us all forward. But even more so, we should always like hold to the light and interrogate, right, what these things actually are and how they're affecting us, and to understand them at the level we are, where we, in the academy don't have to engage with this stuff. But I know that like when I go to the barbershop, this is a conversation I'm fitting to have.
Absolutely.
Right. So I got to be like able to know like, well, what value is the thing that I've learned to do in this space? And if it ain't in service to helping Black people be better and get freer, then it's not really worth that much, because I can't do that just writing journal articles or teaching like, a prestigious institution that most niggas don't have access to. Right. I got to do that shit in Saturday school, at the barber shop, right, pulling the young brother to the side when I see him, on the street or whatever. And that's the responsibility I want us as Black men who benefit from male privilege, right, cis privilege if you're cis, heterosexual privilege if you identify as straight, to take up more seriously the responsibility that we have to hold each other accountable, and not just thinking about fighting white supremacy from our vantage point. Because a lot of Black men are invested in defeating white supremacy only so they can replace their oppressor, right? Have a version of male supremacy. And this is what Bell Hooks teaches us, right? This is what Kimberly Crenshaw teaches us. And so that for me is like where the impetus for a lot of the work happens. And then just trying to find iterations, tweeting being one of them, to be a space where that can actually take place.
Absolutely. And you know what? I love that point that you made about us getting so deep in the knowledge that like there's a fear that we can drown, right? So like I remember I had already listened to Certified Lover Boy all the way through before I even heard about the R. Kelly situation and him getting the writing credit. And for me, I'm finding out, all right, so it was on the intro, but it wasn't the actual song. It was someone speaking and R. Kelly was playing in the background. And so I'm just like, okay, well, how would you sort of advise a Black man who might say something to the effect of, okay, well, it seems so far removed. And if we do that, then like, all right, well, Dr. Dre, let's go there. Like, we gotta knock out Dr. Dre. We gotta knock out Nas, because they've also caused physical harm. They've also caused harm to Black women. Like, where do we stop? Because now I'm drowning. Now, Drake, maybe he has something to do with it, but like, what if he's in a situation like Kanye alleged he was in, where the label dropped the album? And would you say something to the effect of, well, actually, no, I won't ask you that. I won't ask you that yet. But how do we get into the space where we can manage the swimming in the knowledge and going deeper without drowning? Because one might say, well, it's sort of deep in the song and it's not the actual song in and of itself. R. Kelly's just sort of in the background if you listen closely, yada, yada, yada. And then how do we tap into all these other Black men who've caused violence, or all these other entities that have harmed particularly more marginalized people within the Black communities? Like, what do you say to that? Because I think it's a really, really great point. And I think there is a really big fear, and that's why people don't want to go too deep.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's why I'm not a purist about these things. I think we need to have elasticity and flexibility, right? But we also can't use that as an excuse not to hold anyone accountable for anything. Absolutely. And that's what I see it, right? And it's usually for men who also are trying to, find analogs for situations they've been in or ways they've participated or been complicit to sort of get a green light on this, like, I'm not that bad of a person, right? Mm-hmm. Which is not even the arguments being made here, right? I'm not arguing that, like, Drake in and of himself is a terrible person, right? Like, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can critique, right? Or that he individually is solely responsible, right, for that happening, right? What I am saying is at some point during the process that was clear, and this is Drake's album, and Drake is not like another artist, right, that doesn't have creative control or autonomy in the ways that some albums, end up with stuff that people don't necessarily want as a younger artist, right? And part of my saying is that it was known at some point that this was the case. Yeah. And if it was so insignificant, right, if people wanted to diminish it, then it didn't really need to be in the song, did it? Like, you couldn't find something to stand in, right? And again, drawing it back to the scholarly conversation, we make empirical and intellectual choices of who we cite, right? This is a citation practice, right, that we need to think about, because Black people have been engaged in citation for many, many years beyond the academy and the way that it decides to do that, right? And this is what sampling fundamentally is. We want to take it to the music piece.
Oh, that's a bar.
You feel me? Right? Sampling is a form of citation, right? And part of it is building on the legacy sonically of what's been provided before you, right? Which we know for sure is a Ye thing, right? Like no ID, Ye, et cetera. We can do all the derivatives of that, right? But Drake too, and he builds, 40 builds his catalog in such a way that multiple samples are used in multiple songs, even to the point where it's frustrating, right? Like, one of the things that I remain frustrated with Drake to this day, right, is having DMX open up a record, right? And then there's no more DMX on the record, right? Like, I was looking for a lot more than what I was given, even though the track is still hot. But it was like, nah, they do these, there's a formula that they follow that nobody else does in the game that just gets you enticed, right? Even if the title is such that ain't got nothing to do with the song, but it's an interesting title, and therefore right? And in many ways, like, CLB is a very much that, right? It's always that. Like, Drake's albums are consistent in that regard. But anyway, it's a citation practice. So you make choices, which means you could have chose to keep it. You could have chose to let it go. You're obviously a genius enough to construct a record that would equally be as good, and nobody would have known. And I think it says something else to say that we started here, but we realized at the particular moment, like, this is what it was. And we decided to pull the record entirely, right? Or drop that particular part of the sample and just do something else. And so, I think that part is, for me, is to make it clear that, like, no, this isn't all on Drake, but it's not on Drake either. Yeah. Right. And part of it too is that we've just normalized and diminished and minimized the types of harm and violence that become so routine and so everyday. We don't even see when they take place or happen. Right. We're just trying to find, is like our grandmamas would say, the right way to do the wrong thing. And I just don't believe that that's like a real thing that we should be doing. Right. And that's like, niggas just always try to do that in any number of ways. So anyway, so that was that piece. And I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the rest of the question. We just be getting on these diatribes and just be like talking that shit. So I just make sure I'm responding fully to the question that you asked. Oh, like, where do we stop? Right.
Yeah. Where do we draw that line?
Yeah, and I don't know that we do or don't, right? It's that like no one is beyond reproach. And I think that starts at an understanding that all of us individually are capable of doing and receiving harm. So the question then is like, how do you actually engage in accountability and reparation and restoration, right? Moving forward, because it's not that anybody's not going to do these things. It's like, well, what do you do in the wake of that, right? And so if I can liken this to another person that would be in a conversation, right, is Jay, right? Jay on the Kanye album, right? We sort of like, thought about this as a great moment for them to come back together and all these other, things, right? But if we look at Jay's career, and I had said this on like some podcasts long ago, like when 444 just came out, right? Like Jay has absolutely done all the things that regular niggas be doing. He has been more than vocal about that, right? We know that vis-a-vis Beyonce's Lemonade, right? In their context of their relationship, he continued to do those things. But what we saw a bit different from Jay, at least in 444, right, is a certain level of self-accountability and reckoning with the truths of his life, in part dealing with the things that he did to Beyonce and to other women, right? His relationship with his mother in a way that we haven't gotten. And this is a frustration I have generationally of like rappers that, I've appreciated at certain different points in my life. Like certainly when Drake came out, like that's all that was being played, in the club, like that's the thing that people are galvanizing around. But similarly, I often don't stay with artists that I can't grow with. Right. Like that's not my circle no more, or I can just make it what it is and just like it for the sound. Right. But again, for me, it's like, well, if we're evolving and developing, and to your point where we draw the line, to me, it's how do we address and take account for the things that we've done, right, in a sort of public way, right, that signal to others that there is room for evolution and growth. And this is the same thing that happened when Nipsey died, right? Like y'all were in LA when this went down, as was I. And we had to hold space for the complicated grief of Nipsey as we did for Kobe, right? Let's just like keep it a buck, right? Like, and so I can't over demonize, say, Nip, for how he spoke and engaged with certain things, although I think that it could have been wrong and we should be accountable to that in the way that, trans women specifically have done the work to make sure we hold that tension. Right. But like the other thing is Nip came out of a certain context. So I would not expect necessarily things to be that different. And he didn't get the full, version of his life to understand that in a way that would allow for him to make good on it moving forward. So that for me is where it comes down to, right? Like it's not, does Nas get a pass and R. Kelly don't? It's like, well, how are Nas and R. Kelly different? Because they are. And two, right, how have they done work to redress that? Like there is no level of redemption, for anyone who can't first acknowledge the wrongdoing that they've done, the harm that they've caused. And ultimately, it's not even up for me to whether to say like whether we accept this person or not. Because if you ask me like where do we draw the line, I'm gonna tell you that like cisgender heterosexual Black men don't get to determine where that line is.
Oh, that's
right.
Ask Black women, ask Black trans folk, right? Non-binary, gender non-conforming folk, where the line is, right? And that's the problem. Part of the patriarchy in our own minds is this like over-determination of what we get to say, what counts and what don't count. And like Black women and feminist scholars have been trying to tell us like that's the wrong approach to the thing. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's about like who you're answerable to, right? Who is the community that you're answerable to? And it almost always should be the most marginalized, within a particular subset. And this is what I was sort of alluding to of like why we can't get free as a people. That doesn't mean what we're doing and what white people are doing are the same. Or we have the same level of responsibility, right? We have different responsibilities, right? But minimally, it's that we should not engage in inflicting the same types of harm, right, as our general oppressors. I think that is like minimally what we can ask. And so that's really what it was like, the direction it was coming from, or like why I decided to do that. But I could understand there was going to be so much pushback on it, from a very particular group. And I knew that going in, but like I can deal with that. That's fine, right? And if that almost always leads to an intervention for somebody, then it was worth it.
Absolutely.
Right. If you got, 200 followers on Twitter and you worried about what I'm doing, saying I'm doing this and that, whatever, like, I'm not tripping on that, bro. But if you want to have a conversation, like, let's do that. And there were other people who did want to do that. Right. Like, wait, like, tell me what you was saying. Like, I don't fully get it, but it seems like it makes sense. And that's the point for an intervention.
Yeah. And Dr. Davis, like I really, really I love everything that you've been saying. I got a chance to dive a little deeper into your work, and I read your article, What is Misogyny and Why Black Men Should Stop Referring to Black Women as Females. Thought it was brilliant. And I thought it was just like you're kind of talking now, and it translated what it needed to real people. And I feel like a lot of academics don't do that. And that was how we started this podcast. We wanted to take these concepts and bring them to our everyday people, the people we listen to at the barbershop, right? That's cutting our hair, our friends that we grew up in the same communities with that might not have had the chance to get to UCLA and to have these classes. So while we have you on, I would love if you were able to kind of break down a few definitions for us. I think that a lot of this conversation has had a lot to do with misogyny. It's a word that is kind of thrown around on social media, and not often is it defined. And I think that happens in the classrooms too. You have to be brave enough to say, hey, can you define this? And what does this look like on an everyday basis? I really like this quote. You says, misogyny is too easily reduced to extreme forms of how women and girls are despised and disregarded. So I guess that is a two-part question. Would you be able to define misogyny for us? And then could you kind of give us a few examples of what everyday misogyny might look like to us so we are able to identify it?
Yeah. So first I want to shout out Black Men Build. It's an amazing organization, that's happening all across the country right now, with chapters developing every day. Shout out to Philip Agnew, to Tef Poe in St. Louis, my man Steve Pargett, Rachel Gilmer down at Dream Defenders. All the folks who are involved in, sort of the publication that's called Wartime, which is the pain, political publication of Black Men Build. And also for them, right, just holding the space and offering me an opportunity to have a conversation. So I think part of it, and we went through iterations of this, right? Revision is the most important part of the writing process. There's no such thing as good writing, only rewriting. And going through those iterations is always helpful for me, right? As an academic who's primarily speaking to audiences that have a particular jargon, a way of understanding, some presumptions about, previous knowledge on part of the reader that doesn't always exist in the public sphere, and you have to explain yourself differently. But it pushed me even to think about, how do you constantly have a conversation about these things in ways that's non-academic and not intellectualized, but like really base level. And so part of the expose or the essay rather in the publication is trying to sort of like elucidate that, right? In a way that says, like, at a base level, what are we talking about? And what are the assumptions that go into it on either end, right? What do I assume that but also what do you assume about what a thing is that maybe it isn't, right? Because like words mean things, right? We've seen this on Twitter. But also as like a, sociocultural anthropologist, I understand that language, right, takes on its own form and its own meaning in a different context, right? And we see this in the opposite way when like white people try to use words that we be using on the regular, right? And then just mess it all up, or they take it like literally, right? And it's like, nah, that's not right. But you have no sociolinguistic context, as we would say in the academy, or you don't understand what language means in the space and place and the people who use it. So, when it comes to this idea of misogyny, that's been a thing I've even wrestled with and sat with, because I think what we often try to do, right, and we see this a lot, which is still about patriarchy and control and domination, is this desire for men, and this is a great point with the Drake conversation, right? Like, certain light-skinned nigga behavior, if we can call it that, right? And the extent to which it's like we just trying to not be, what other men are, or a lighter version of that, right? And what it does is it puts this veneer over fundamentally what is the same thing, right? It's like that. And when people say this, right, like a light skinned nigga can get away with X, Y, and Z. You can't do that if you're dark skinned, which is true in a bunch of different ways, but it includes how it is that we engage and treat women, or the types of behaviors that we expect, right? Again, based on narrow definitions of masculinity. And I think part of that is that we reduce certain types of violence, right, in this hierarchy, right? And to some extent it is, and we can name that for what it is. But I think all too often, in the same way that we will not allow racism to be reduced to a particular set of overt actions, we cannot reduce misogyny to things that only are like considered the extreme, right? Which could be sexual violence of a particular nature, right? Language of a particular sort, opposed to the everyday ways that we engage in the dismissal and disregard of women. That can be their opinions or perspectives, right? The extent to which we strip them of their agency and decisions, like what's happening in Texas, right? Or what's even happening in our interpersonal relationships. And this is, I think, the most important part, right? Misogyny does operate for sure at a systemic and, structural level. I am most concerned with how we as Black men engage in everyday misogyny with the people in our immediate proximity, right? Because we're at this moment, and we've seen this a lot with these like quote unquote relationship experts and dating gurus, right? Right. It's a bunch of Black men in marriages like cheating on their wives.
Yeah.
Right. And you saying all this stuff about what brothers should and shouldn't do. And I understand that, like, do better, than I'm doing, don't do as I do, that whole kind of thing. But like, fam, don't be out here doing all this stuff in your work and you treat your wife like garbage, right? Your mama like garbage, your daughter like garbage, right? Or allow that to be happening in a certain kind of way. And so I want us to think about this as like a set of relationships, not just a set of actions, right? And that, and my father sort of taught me very early that like, you don't want to ever engage with a woman in a way you would not want to see me engage with their mother or someone to engage with your sister. Right now, that's great. And it's been very helpful. But the part of that too, is that we then create these exceptions, right, for who's now willing, right, or who are willing to engage in these types of practices. And this is the thing that I struggle with, even to a certain extent, one of thinking about, you know, when and where and how I use the B word, right, which I will call the B word moving forward, because I don't think I deserve the right to be able to articulate myself in such a way, knowing that it's a pejorative term for women. So that being said, and this is the trickiest part too, right, is our first response as Black men dealing with white women engaged in racism is going to be what? Right, we're going to dip into that misogyny bag, right?
Oh, you
right?
preaching. Oh,
Now,
I'm shivering.
Now that is what it is. And I understand that, right? We try to fight power with the power that we have. And as like men, we again have a certain relationship to patriarchy that allows us to do that. But what we see is that when we engage in the behaviors that white men do against women, white or otherwise, right, we will be held to a different standard and be held accountable by the carceral justice system. Even more so, the more we normalize our engagement, right, with white women who may be engaged in racism against us, with misogyny against them, right, we build a certain pattern, a certain habit of mind that says this is a normal way to engage with women generally, whether it seems intentional or subconscious, right? And so for me, I can think about this in so many different contexts when we think about the political conversation around like Hillary Clinton, for example. And they're saying like, oh, sexism is like the reason that she's not being able to be elevated, which I wholly agree with, right? And I took the position of, well, we should defend Hillary Clinton against sexism, but we should also defend Black people against Hillary Clinton.
That's a point.
That we need to be able to hold space to do both at the same time, that it shouldn't be an exchange one over the other, right? Because we fight racism not with misogyny, but with solidarity.
Oh,
you feel me? And so when we're talking, and so the political implications of what I've been talking about is that we can't actually build any form of racial solidarity if we are disrupting the very solidarity that we're intending to build by engaging in homophobia, by engaging in misogyny, right? By engaging in ageism, classism, so forth and so on, because the substance of Black people is multitudes. So if we don't hold space for those multitudes, right, recognize our solidarity in those multitudes, then how could we move forward as a collective, right? We could move forward with a different set of leadership, right, that still has a hierarchical structure, but we can't move forward and be free because our freedom is still predicated, right, on the harm and the subjugation of others, which always, again, tend to be Black women, Black trans folks, Black folks with disabilities, right, Black folks that are living in poverty, all these sorts of things. And so that's, again, like going back to the point, that's what it was all really about, right? And so when I come back to this thing about, you know, misogyny, it's just all the like everyday little ways that we just do these types of things that we take for granted, right? Like men's only spaces, not that we don't need our spaces to do the certain things we need to do, right? That may be harmful to other people and we need to reserve that to a space that's, you know, safer for both us and them. But, you know, are you disregarding the perspectives and opinions of women in your everyday work, right? Are you reducing the types of harm that they experience when they share these things with you as something that's otherwise insignificant, opposed to deferring to their, you know, truth, right? Their lived experience and being the sole experts of that experience. You know, when you're constructing this notion of what like good leadership looks like, does that include, right, the voices, representations of these other folks, right? And if it doesn't, why is that? Right. And it's not that you don't defer to that, right? I think you're socialized into thinking about that in a bunch of ways, right? If I'm asked like, oh, what scholars are doing what work, I do have to be intentional of not just naming like other Black male scholars, right? I know most of those folks and they're in my network, but I'm like, oh, there's someone else who does the same work, right? Maybe even does it better than the other person I was going to name, that I need to make sure that I'm in tune with, which also then constructs for me, and this is the point I'll end on, right? How we surround ourselves in this digitally mediated moment, right? Who are you following and who are your followers? And this is a very good indication, right? At some point I realized, and we all do this Facebook purge like every election cycle, right? But when these moments happen, I be purging also, right? I'm like, oh, I outgrew this nigga. I tried to give him some space and like, we just not on the same wave. And like, I don't feel no kind of way about it. I just don't follow you no more. And when I was more intentional about curating my people that I follow, because I wanted to learn opposed to be, you know, this place where people come to feel like they can learn and I don't have space to develop as well. It was like, no, I need to be intentional of like seeking out, right, you know, folks who talk knowledgeably about these particular issues so that I can learn and do my work in my community, which is with other Black men, not so I can be out here being some expert on feminism and patriarchy. Like that ain't the goal, right? I'm not here to talk to the masses in that regard. That space should be for those in the same way that like race stuff should be the, you know, space for us. And so I wanted to curate that following so I would just be better knowledged, if I can, you know, borrow that phrasing from a former congresswoman. And then I could also see who would leave in moments that I post things that might be interpreted as controversial, right?
Mm.
Like, are you going to drop off when like I'm calling us out? Because that's the other thing too. When I talk about this stuff, I had to be very cognizant of not doing the you thing, right? Like y'all niggas need to get it together. It's like, no, we
We've
the
talked
collective,
about
the
that.
collective
Absolutely.
nigga needs to
Yeah.
get this together, right? And I'm part of that.
Absolutely. Us
And
too.
I think that is part of it too, of this desire not to be separate from, but included within, which means I have a greater responsibility opposed to like, yeah, all of y'all need to do this and I'm doing it. Because
Mhm.
I pretended to be that I'm perfect. And, you know, as Cornell West would say, any moment that you feel, you know, that you're sort of like on your high horse and above yourself, you will be re-nigrified, right?
Oh.
And we think about niggering as a process, which means like you step out of line with white people, they're going to let you know, right? Cam Newton, you got to go, right? Whoever it is at the day.
Mhm.
And the same thing can happen, as we've seen, right? When we step out of line thinking you got all the answers, you doing all the things right, and you slip up, and like the receipts will be there because we live in a world of nothing but receipts, right? I have 87,000 receipts on Twitter, right? Just from tweeting for like the last 10 years. So somebody gonna pull them receipts, right?
Mhm.
And that's why I think, you know, again, you know, from an accountability standpoint for us, it's like, how do you just live a more transparent life? How do you be honest about the things you've done and not done, and how you've moved on from them, and how you've like tried to build, you know, better relationships, how you've engaged in repair and restoration, because that's what people want. They just don't want to be lied to, right? They don't want to be duped. We don't want people saying that like, oh, I don't benefit from massaging, or I'm not massaging. It's like, of course you are. Maybe not the same level, but if we don't start where we're at, that we're all again capable of doing and receiving, we can't move forward in a way that's like a healing pathway for everybody.
Yeah. Dr. Davis, you've been preaching. You took us to church this fine Friday.
I just be talking, man.
Well, look, it was a good
Man.
Friday. We appreciate you coming on and taking the time to share your wisdom and your knowledge with us. Is there anything else you would like to kind of say before we close out the show?
I mean, not a lot, man. I just want to, you know, encourage people that if you don't have a political home, to find one in your city. You know, all organizing is local, right? All activism is local. I talked about being in proximity, right, to your folks, and taking up that arm from where you're at. So I would encourage folks to find an organization that they can be a part of, find community they can be a part of. And, you know, I would say in addition to that, just know that we are all, you know, engaged in the process of teaching and learning. And so the more that we can commit to being lifelong students and whatever our domains that we feel like we need to be better edified, right, and to know more, that we should do that, regardless if you have a PhD or you have a GED or you have no degree. Learning is a constant and continuous process, and we must always value the spaces that teach us, right, that give us education from the folks that we think that don't have none. And so I'll just kind of leave it at that. And, you know, just again, appreciate y'all for inviting me on, holding the space, let me talk my shit, and hopefully we can do it again.
Absolutely. We would absolutely love to.
For sure.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. Again, just for taking the time to do what you do best. And we will see you soon, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I appreciate y'all.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Have a good day.
You too.